Hey YouTube, Joyboy here. Got an interesting discussion for you all today, but before I get into that, I just wanted to say I did my first ever collab with another real collab with a One Piece YouTuber here named StrawhatHQ. In the video, we discussed the 5 most interesting female characters in One Piece, and we each had different sort of choices and discussed it. It's really interesting and a bit long, but definitely worth your time. So if you want to go check that out, you can go click this link right here. But without further ado, let's get into the actual topic of this video, which is a really huge topic, especially in the One Piece universe. When people rank, things that are most mysterious, this often ranks at the top of them, which is, the Will of D. Now, I'm not going to actually theorize a lot about what the Will of D is. I'm actually going to explain it so that you'll see that I've already actually done a bit of a theory on what I think the Will of D is. But without further ado, let's get into this. So to start with, I think it's important to start here, which is there's a very, very common theory that pretty much almost everyone believes, that the D's are the descendants of the Ancient Kingdom. I debated on whether or not I wanted to discuss this or not, but since I'm doing it, I might as well give a brief explanation as to why people think that, in case some people out there don't understand why or don't know. So first of all, we know that the biggest reason why that we know that the D's are related to the Ancient Kingdom, or we highly suspect it, is that during the Skypiea arc, when Robin was talking to Gonfall, they were talking about the similarities between Gold D. Roger and Monkey D. Luffy. And so when Gonfall learned about their shared D initial, he wondered if that was the reason why that they were so similar. And Robin responds with, perhaps, but maybe that's another lost history, or something along those lines, highly suggesting that the D's are synonymous with the poneglyphs and the true history. Going into Robin's history specifically, she actually asked about the Will of D more than any character in the entire One Piece, or she mentions the Will of D more than any other character, which is that back in the Alabasta arc, when she was first introduced, she met Monkey D. Luffy, and she asked him specifically, what is the Will of D? Of course, Luffy had no idea. But then she mentions it again to Gonfall, and then later on she asks Rayleigh what the Will of D is. And to me, what this signifies is that Robin has been hearing about the Will of D. She's learned of it, and it's curious to her. Given her history reading the poneglyphs, I think she most likely got this term from actually reading the poneglyphs, which is that the D's and the Will of D was specifically mentioned on one or more of the poneglyphs that she read. Again, further tying the D's and the Ancient Kingdom. We also know from Jaguar D. Saul that everyone in his family possessed the initial D. We can also see this with the Monkey D family as well, which is that everyone in their family also possesses this initial D. And this highly suggests that the D is passed down generations, all the way down from the Void Century, if the D is related to the Ancient Kingdom, which again highly suggests that the D's were the people who back 900 years ago were a part of the Ancient Kingdom. Roger also tells us that the story of the D and the significance of the initial D dates back to long ago, when he was having a conversation with Whitebeard during a flashback of Whitebeard's before Whitebeard was about to die. And this proves that the D initial at least dates back to really long ago, and coupled with all this other information suggests that the D initial arose from the Void Century. Lastly, we know that the D's supposedly are enemies of God. And if we take the enemies of God and God to represent the people who think that they are gods, which are the celestial dragons, and the creators of the world government, then the D's being the enemies of God could be a direct reference to the historical Ancient Kingdom and their relation to the Ancient Kingdom and their fight versus the 20 kings who ended up creating the world government. So this is why people highly suspect that the D's are the descendants of the Ancient Kingdom. There's a lot more evidence that you can potentially go into to explain this as well that I haven't excluded, but I feel like this train of thought right there that I just gave you is pretty definitive on its own, and so we'll just leave it there. And so going back to Whitebeard's final moments, a lot of what he said here is really interesting. I've discussed it in my Roger's Will theory, but basically here's how it goes. Whitebeard remembers his conversation with Roger, and specifically this conversation was about the D's. And then the next scene is Whitebeard discussing that Teach wasn't the one, and this clearly implies wasn't the D Roger was looking for. And so he says these really interesting things, but basically he says that and one day someone will appear who will inherit Ace's will, and who inherits Roger's will. And as long as that bloodline, so the bloodline of the D, survives, their flames will never die. And so if the flames of the D never die, then we can make an assumption here that Roger's will and Ace's will aren't necessarily their own will, but rather the flames of their ancestors who have been passed down to them. These flames, or this will that will never die. And I think what this is the will of D. And so what we can basically say here is that as long as a D survives, the will of D survives. And so just by possessing the initial D, we can be sure that that person, for the most part, will possess the will of the D. Although Blackbeard seems to be an exception in this case, we're just going to ignore him for the purposes of this discussion. And so Whitebeard also says this, and this is as obvious as it could possibly be without being outright stated, which he says that will, and this is in response to his comment that their flames will never die, so another way of saying their will never die, that will has been passed down from long ago, i.e. the Void Century. And in the future, someday, a man will appear bearing the weight of centuries of history on his shoulders to challenge the world. So basically, a D will appear someday in the future bearing the weight of centuries of history, because the Ds go back all the way to the Void Century and to the Ancient Kingdom, and will someday challenge the world. And so all this information makes it absolutely definitively clear to me that the will of D, another name for the will of D really, is the will of the Ancient Kingdom. Both of these wills are the exact same thing. And even going into my Roger's will theory, Roger being a D and having inherited the will of D from his ancestors, the flames that will never die, then Roger's will is also the will of D. And so Googling the word will and what it actually means in this context, as an explanation here, is that basically the thing that someone desires or wants, right? So that is their will, something that they desire. And so if we look at the will of the Ancient Kingdom, what does the Ancient Kingdom want? Well, I think that is the source of the conflict versus the 20 kings. They ultimately lost, and they passed down their history and their ideals on the poneglyphs. But this history and ideals are their will, basically. It describes what they wanted. And so I've already done a theory about what the Ancient Kingdom wants. While this isn't all-encompassing, there could be other things as well. We know that Clover mentioned a disagreement in ideals between the Ancient Kingdom and the 20 Kings. And then ultimately the Ancient Kingdom lost this battle and the 20 Kings won. And so whatever the source of this conflict was, these differing ideals, whatever was the ideal of the Ancient Kingdom, clearly they lost out, and so the world government now was able to impress their ideals onto the world through their control of the world. And I've speculated that one of these ideals that the Ancient Kingdom fought for and the world government fought against was the ideal of the protection of the equality of all the different tribes and races within the One Piece world. We can see that the world government have historically made these kinds of people into slaves, and in general have shown no respect to them. This is especially true today when looking at the descendants of the 20 Kings, the Celestial Dragons, whereas the Ancient Kingdom has clearly had allies with all these various groups. And you can even see in Luffy, if Luffy has inherited the will of D, we know that Luffy knows nothing about the true history, yet we know that he's inherited this will of D. And so I think that it could be just naturally Luffy expresses what the will of D is. And we can see that Luffy really doesn't care what your race is or anything like that. He just wants everyone to be free. And so there's actually even evidence to support the idea that Luffy and other Ds are just inherently carriers of the will of D just by being Ds. And this is given to us the first time will of D is ever mentioned in the story by Dr. Kureha, where she sees that Monkey D. Luffy's middle initial is D and states the will of D still survives, which implies that just by being a D, the will of D is continued on. And this is again supported implied through Whitebeard, which is that Whitebeard says the flame of the D never dies. And so then also on top of that, he also mentions or asks, if Luffy is the carrier of the will of D, then show me what the new era looks like. Which basically implies that the will of D is just something that naturally exists within the carriers of the D initial. Luffy has shown that not only does he want to protect his own freedom, but in pretty much every arc, there's a situation in which he shows that he wants to protect the freedom of others as well. When Kami was about to be turned into a slave and sold at the auction house, Luffy expressed the will of D, in my opinion, which was that he protected her freedom because she didn't deserve to have her freedom taken away from her. And for Luffy, someone's freedom is pretty much the most important thing that someone could have. And this is really the main idea behind what being a pirate is, which being a pirate is basically you have the freedom to go out, or you're basically going out and you're free to do whatever it is that you like to do. That's how a pirate lives his life, and that's why Luffy so badly wanted to become a pirate and wants to become the Pirate King. So to sum all these ideas together, I think that freedom and the will of D are inexorably tied. I think that the will of D centers hugely around the concept of freedom, because when you look at all the members of the family D, all of them prize and usually possess this desire for some kind of freedom, even for those that are maybe less free than many of the others, like Garp, who's a Marine Vice Admiral. He didn't ever want to become an admiral because he liked his position as it was because of the freedom that it offered him. So I think we can put an umbrella under a lot of these ideas and say that the will of D is the freedom of everyone. Or perhaps another way of saying this is the will of D is free will, which is that the people who were the D's, their desires were that people have the freedom to choose what it is that they wanted to do, rather than being told what to do. But this doesn't necessarily mean that this is the only thing that's a part of the will of D. As I said before, the will is sort of the desires of the ancient kingdom. And while I think that freedom is probably the most obvious thing that's tied with these descendants of the ancient kingdom, these Ds, and encompasses their will, I think that there could be other things as well. But I definitely do think that freedom is the will of D, or free will is the will of D. So yeah, that's all I really wanted to say here. Again, this is more of an explanation as to what the will of D is, and then sort of tying it back to something that I've already sort of discussed as being part of the will of D without actually saying the word or the phrase will of D. But let me know what you think. Leave a comment if you disagree, or if you agree, or if you have more to say, or whatever you want to talk about. Like the video if you like the video. Subscribe if you're new and you want to be notified for my future videos. And again, also check out StrawhatHQ and our video that we did together, the 5 most interesting females in One Piece. And as always, have a wonderful day.